Two boys were running through an abandoned Tampa field on a sweltering summer afternoon in 1984, chasing a homemade parachute they'd thrown into the air. The makeshift toy caught the wind wrong and drifted into a patch of overgrown grass near the tree line. When the older boy pushed it through the weeds to retrieve it, he stopped dead. There, partially hidden by the tall grass, was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A body, decomposed, bound, the hands tied cruelly behind the back with a cord wrapped 3 times around the neck like some kind of leash. And underneath the body, placed there deliberately, was a white silk scarf. The boys ran, and Tampa's nightmare officially began. Nebraska Avenue in Tampa, during the summer of 1984, wasn't exactly a place you'd want to raise kids. The street pulsed with neon signs advertising adult entertainment, cheap motels, and dive bars. Prostitutes worked the corners, drug dealers operated in the shadows. And somewhere in that darkness, a predator had started hunting. When Detective Charles Diggs arrived at the field where those two boys had made their terrible discovery, he knew immediately this wasn't a simple case. The victim was 20-year-old Lana Long. She'd been gone for weeks, and the Florida heat had done its work on her remains. But what caught Diggs's attention wasn't the state of decomposition. It was the level of violence. The ligature marks on her neck told a story. This person didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to suffer. The cord had been pulled with far more force than necessary. Think about that for a second. The amount of force required to end someone's life by strangulation is actually relatively minimal if your only goal is to cause the person to pass. But that's not what happened here. The killer had applied crushing, brutal force. This was someone who enjoyed what they were doing. And then there was that white silk scarf, placed deliberately beneath the body like a signature. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of Tampa residents sleeping a little less soundly. 2 weeks of Detective Gary Terry hoping against hope that this was an isolated incident. Then his phone rang. Another body had been found. As Terry drove to the scene, he kept thinking, please don't let her be bound. Please let this be unrelated. It wasn't different. The pattern emerges. Michelle Sims had been 22 years old. She'd once been a beauty contestant, the kind of girl with a bright future and big dreams ahead of her. But addiction doesn't care about your potential. It had dragged her down into the dark world of prostitution to feed a habit she couldn't break. And in that world, she'd crossed paths with something evil. She was found in a desolate area, bound just like the first victim. The same brutal violence, the same excessive force. But this time, the killer made a mistake. Actually, he made several critical mistakes that would eventually lead to his capture. The ground where Michelle's body was discovered was sandy, and it had captured something incredibly valuable for investigators. Tire tracks. Not just any tire tracks, but 3 distinct tire impressions. The front tire was a common Goodyear model. Nothing special or unusual about that. But the right rear tire was more interesting. It was a Goodyear Viva white wall, and whoever mounted it had done something odd and distinctive. They'd installed it with the white decorative side facing inward. You wouldn't notice it unless you looked closely, but it was distinctive. And then there was the left rear tire. This one was special. It was a Vogue tire, an expensive specialty item that wasn't sold in regular retail stores. These tires came as factory equipment on luxury vehicles, specifically Cadillacs. But Detective Terry and his team were about to discover something even more valuable than tire tracks. In the forensics lab, Technicians were going over Michelle Sims's clothing with meticulous care. They used tape to lift any trace evidence from the fabric, examining every inch under microscopes. This is painstaking work. You're looking at fabric that's been exposed to who knows what. And somewhere in all of that, you're hoping to find something that connects to the killer. And that's when they found them. Red fibers. Microscopic red fibers clinging to the clothing. Now, finding fibers on clothing isn't unusual. We pick up fibers from everything we come in contact with throughout the day. But these fibers were special. They were triangular trilobal nylon fibers. And when the technicians compared them to fibers found on Lana Long's clothing, they discovered something remarkable. The fibers were identical, not just similar, identical. Same dye lot, same manufacturing batch, the exact same microscopic characteristics in every measurable way. Let me explain what that means. When carpet manufacturers produce automotive carpeting, they use specific dye lots for coloring. Each batch has microscopic variations that are like fingerprints. The chemical composition is slightly different. Under a comparison microscope, trained forensic scientists can determine if two fibers came from the same manufacturing run. These fibers matched perfectly. These were automotive carpet fibers, and they meant that both victims had been in the same vehicle. The same killer. Detective Terry made a decision right then that would prove crucial to catching this predator. He decided to keep the fiber evidence secret. Completely secret. No press releases, no details shared with reporters, nothing. Why? Because Terry had studied the Wayne Williams case in Atlanta, where a serial killer had been ending the lives of young African-American males. During that investigation, newspapers had reported details about the trace evidence police were finding, specifically dog hair and carpet fibers. And what did Williams do? He changed his methods. He started dumping bodies in rivers to wash away evidence. Terry wasn't going to give Tampa's killer the same advantage. The bodies kept coming. September 18th, 1984. Chanel Williams, just 18 years old, became the third victim. This one was different in some ways. She'd been shot in the head. She wasn't bound like the others. On the surface, it looked like a completely unrelated case. But when forensics examined her clothing, there they were again. The same red trilobal fibers. Victim number 4 was Karen Dinsfriend, 28 years old. Same fibers, same killer. And Tampa was in a full panic. The newspapers were calling him the Tampa Serial Killer. Women were afraid to go out at night. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. But they had a problem. They had evidence. They had a pattern. They had tire tracks and fibers. But they didn't have a suspect. They didn't have a single viable lead. Until November 1984, when everything changed. Lisa McVey was 17 years old, and honestly, she was tired. Not just physically tired from working the night shift at a donut shop. She was tired of life. The night before, she'd written a letter planning to take her own life. She'd been living with her grandmother and her grandmother's boyfriend. And that boyfriend had been doing unspeakable things to her for 3 years, putting a gun to her head while he did it. It was 2:30 in the morning on November 3rd when she finished her shift and got on her bicycle to ride home. The streets were empty, dark. She was thinking about that letter. Violent hands emerged from behind a parked van, grabbing her and knocking her off her bicycle. She felt herself being dragged by the hair, felt the cold metal of a gun against her temple. She was thrown into a car, and a blindfold was wrapped around her eyes. For the next 26 hours, Lisa McVey lived through every nightmare you can imagine. Rape, sodomy, psychological torture, being told repeatedly that she was going to be gone. She was convinced this was it. This was how her life would end. But something interesting happened in Lisa's mind during those horrific hours. She'd spent the night before ready to end her own life. But now that someone else was trying to take it from her, now she wanted to live. Think about that. This 17-year-old girl made a conscious decision in the midst of unimaginable horror. She decided to fight, not physically. She knew she couldn't win that way, but mentally. She was going to outsmart this monster. She started memorizing everything, every sound, every smell, every detail. When her captor let her use the bathroom, still blindfolded, she systematically touched every surface she could reach. The sink, the toilet, the walls. She was leaving her fingerprints everywhere. If he did end her life, at least the police would know she'd been there. She looked for gaps in the blindfold, and she found them. When you clench your jaw, your face changes shape slightly. So every time her attacker put the blindfold on, Lisa would clench her jaw hard. Then later, when she relaxed it, the blindfold would be just loose enough for her to peek out. And what she saw would eventually help catch a serial killer. Through those tiny gaps beneath her blindfold, Lisa observed everything with the focus of a trained detective. On the dashboard of the car, she spotted the word Magnum. She noted the white bucket seats, unusual for that era. And most importantly, she saw red carpeting throughout the interior of the vehicle. During the 26 hours she was held captive, her attacker drove her around several times. Lisa paid attention to every turn, every landmark she could spot. At one point, she noticed 2 hotels positioned side by side, a Howard Johnson's and a Quality Inn, with Interstate 275 running between them. That was a specific, identifiable location. But perhaps the most crucial moment came when her abductor stopped somewhere and Lisa heard a distinctive sound. The electronic beeping of a 24-hour ATM machine. Let that sink in for a moment. This is 1984. ATM machines are still relatively new technology. Most of them keep electronic records of every transaction, including the date, time, and account information. If police could figure out which ATM and what time, they'd have a direct trail to the killer's identity. Lisa did something else that was incredibly smart. She talked to her captor. She humanized herself. She told him she was taking care of a sick parent. She said he seemed like a nice guy, considering everything she'd been through. She even offered to be his secret girlfriend. Was it true? Of course not. But Lisa understood something about abusers. She'd been abused for years. She knew how their minds worked. She knew that if she could make this monster see her as a person, as someone useful to him alive rather than gone, she had a better chance of survival. It worked. At dawn on November 4th, after 26 hours of captivity, her attacker drove Lisa to a location near her grandmother's house and released her. He warned her not to remove her blindfold for 5 minutes. She waited, heard the car drive away, and then pulled off the blindfold. She was alive. Lisa was rushed to the hospital where doctors performed a complete examination and collected evidence. Her clothing was carefully preserved and sent to the forensics lab. But before those results could come back, Detective Terry received yet another call about another body. Kim Swan, victim number 5. And then the lab results on Lisa McVey's clothing came back. Red nylon trilobal fibers, the exact same fibers found on every single deceased victim. For the first time since this investigation began, police had something they never thought they'd get: a living witness, someone who could identify the killer, someone who could testify in court. Except there was a problem. Lisa had been blindfolded the entire time. She never saw her attacker's face. Everything she had was circumstantial. Details about a car, locations, sounds, but no face. Still, it was more than they'd had before. The investigation shifted into high gear. That word, Magnum, Lisa had seen, led them to one specific vehicle, the 1978 Dodge Magnum. They ran computer searches for every registered owner in the Tampa area. 486 vehicles came up. That's still way too many. They needed something else. And then someone remembered Lisa mentioning the ATM beeping. Investigators pulled bank records from November 4th. They were looking for any ATM transaction that occurred early morning in the general area where Lisa had been dropped off. Then they cross-referenced those names with the list of Dodge Magnum owners. One name appeared on both lists: Robert Joseph Long, 31 years old, X-ray technician, separated from his wife, father of two, Bobby Joe Long. They had their suspect, but they couldn't arrest him yet. Lisa couldn't provide positive identification because she'd been blindfolded. They needed more evidence. So they put Long under 24-hour surveillance and waited. For days, detectives followed him. They watched him go to work, watched him come home. He had no idea investigators were documenting his every move. The opportunity came when Long drove to a movie theater. While he was inside, deputies quietly approached his Dodge Magnum in the parking lot. They examined the tires without touching the vehicle. Goodyear Viva white wall on the right rear, expensive Vogue tire on the left rear. Both mounted with the white walls facing inward, exactly as the crime scene tire tracks had shown. It was him. When Bobby Joe Long walked out of that movie theater, deputies were waiting. They arrested him on the spot. The look on his face, according to the arresting officers, was complete shock. He thought he'd gotten away with everything. They took him to the station and obtained search warrants for his vehicle and apartment. His blood type matched semen evidence collected from the victims. But the absolute proof, the undeniable evidence that sealed his fate, was found inside his Dodge Magnum. Red nylon trilobal carpet fibers, microscopically identical to the fibers found on every single victim, both gone and alive. The forensic analysis was damning. Scientists compared the fibers from Long's vehicle to the fibers found on all the victims. Same triangular cross-section, same dye lot, same manufacturing characteristics. The statistical probability of these fibers coming from any source other than Long's vehicle was essentially zero. The killer's method became horrifyingly clear once they understood the fiber transfer. Bobby Joe Long would pick up his victims, force them into his car at gunpoint, and make them strip. Their clothing would end up on the floorboard of his vehicle. As the terrified women struggled, kicked, and fought during the assaults, their clothes would systematically pick up fiber after fiber from that red carpet. Every movement transferred more fibers, every kick, every struggle. Each fiber was a microscopic witness, a tiny thread connecting the killer to his victims. Long had no idea he was leaving evidence. He thought he was being careful. He was wrong. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Bobby Joe Long's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He confessed to everything. The attacks on Lisa McVey, and the others. So many others. 10 victims in total. 10 young women whose lives he'd stolen. Some of the bodies hadn't even been discovered yet. Long led police to their locations. The microscopic red fibers that Long never knew existed became the silent prosecutors in his trial. Scientists explained to the jury how fiber transfer works, how these particular fibers came from automotive carpeting, how the dye lot and manufacturing characteristics proved they all came from the same source. Bobby Joe Long was convicted and sentenced to the ending of his own life. But the story doesn't end there. Lisa McVey survived. But more than that, she transformed her trauma into purpose in a way that most people would find impossible to comprehend. Less than 2 years after her ordeal, she married a police officer and had a daughter. Think about that courage for a moment. Think about how easily she could have let that experience destroy her. But Lisa chose differently. Instead of letting Bobby Joe Long's violence define the rest of her life, she built a family. In 1999, 15 years after her abduction, Lisa made a decision that surprised many people who knew her story. She joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, the same department that had investigated her case, the same department that had caught her attacker. She became a deputy, specializing in crimes against children and working to protect the vulnerable. Think about what that means. Every day, she went to work knowing she might encounter victims going through similar trauma to what she'd experienced. She didn't run from it. She ran toward it. By 2018, she'd become a master deputy, serving for over 20 years with distinction. Her colleagues describe her as one of the most dedicated and compassionate officers in the department. She works as a middle school resource officer, talking to students about safety, about survival, about never giving up hope, even when things seem impossible. She speaks openly about what happened to her now. She visits schools and community centers, sharing her story not for sympathy, but to educate, to help other potential victims understand how to stay safe, to teach them that survival is possible. She has a grown daughter and a granddaughter now, a family she created, a life filled with purpose. When Governor Ron DeSantis signed Bobby Joe Long's ending warrant in April 2019, the first such warrant he signed after taking office in January, Lisa McVey Noland was among the first people notified. The execution was scheduled for May 23, 2019, more than 34 years after Long's crimes. Those 34 years had been difficult for Lisa in ways most people don't see. Yes, she'd built a successful career and a loving family. But she'd also lived every single one of those years, knowing that the man who'd tortured her was still alive. She'd told reporters before the execution that she hadn't had a full night's sleep since 1984. 35 years of interrupted sleep. 35 years of nightmares. Knowing that he is going to die, she said in an interview, "I'm hoping to get a full night's sleep without any interruptions." Lisa attended that execution. She made sure she would be there. She sat in the front row of the witness gallery, wearing a shirt that read, "Long overdue." She wanted to be the first person Bobby Joe Long saw when he opened his eyes for the last time. She wanted him to know that she'd survived, that she'd won. He never opened them, and he never said a word. His last word, when asked if he had any final statement, was simply a no. Some witnesses say he kept his eyes closed the entire time, perhaps afraid to face the people he'd hurt. At 6:55 p.m. on May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long was pronounced gone by lethal injection. He'd spent over 30 years on death row. After witnessing the execution, Lisa spoke to reporters outside the prison. She was crying, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. Tears of finally being able to close this chapter of her life. She talked about the 10 angels, as she called the women Long had ended. She said she dedicated her life to being the voice of the victims. And then she said something remarkable, something that showed just how much strength this woman possessed. She said she'd forgiven Long, not because he deserved forgiveness, he didn't, but because holding on to that hatred would have been like living in a prison without walls. "I chose not to become a victim," she said. "I chose to survive, Lisa McVey Noland continues to serve as a deputy with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office today in 2025. She's been in that role for over 25 years now. Think about that dedication. Quarter of a century protecting the community that she's part of. She continues to speak to students about personal safety and survival. She continues to advocate for victims of violent crimes. She continues to work with organizations that support survivors of trauma. And she continues to live a life that proves something important. Trauma doesn't have to define you. What happens to you doesn't determine who you become. The 17-year-old girl who wrote a note planning to take her own life on November 2nd, 1984, grew up to become a warrior for others who feel hopeless. The young woman who was abducted and tortured for 26 hours became the person who finally ended a serial killer's reign of terror. She not only survived, she won, completely and totally won. The case of the Tampa Serial Killer is ultimately a story about the smallest details making the biggest difference. Bobby Joe Long thought he was being careful. He selected vulnerable victims who society often overlooked. He dumped bodies in remote locations. He used a common vehicle that wouldn't stand out. He bound his victims in ways that asserted his complete control. But he never considered the microscopic evidence he was leaving behind with every single crime. Those red carpet fibers, invisible to the naked eye, became the threads that unraveled his entire life. Each fiber was a whispered accusation. Each microscopic strand was a voice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The forensic science that caught Long was relatively new at the time. Fiber analysis was becoming more sophisticated, but it wasn't yet common in every investigation. Detective Terry's decision to keep the fiber evidence secret was brilliant. If Long had known about it, he could have changed vehicles, cleaned more thoroughly, altered his methods. But he didn't know. So he kept leaving evidence at every single crime scene. And then there's Lisa McVey, a 17-year-old girl who'd been abused and traumatized to the point where she was ready to end her own life. But when faced with someone trying to take that choice away from her, she found strength she didn't know she had. She fought back with intelligence and courage. She gathered evidence while being held captive. She left her fingerprints everywhere. She memorized details. She survived. Her survival, combined with meticulous forensic science and determined police work, brought down a predator who thought he was untouchable. There's something profound about the image of those microscopic red fibers. Bobby Joe Long installed that carpet in his vehicle himself. It was supposed to be an upgrade, something that made the car more comfortable. Instead, it became the instrument of his destruction. Every fiber that transferred to his victim's clothing was another thread connecting him to his crimes. Another piece of evidence he couldn't see, but couldn't escape. The red thread of justice, invisible but unbreakable. 10 women gone, 10 lives stolen, 10 families left to grieve. But because of one survivor's courage and one detective's careful investigation, no more names were added to that list. How many other women did Lisa McVey save by surviving and helping catch Long? We'll never know, but we know it's more than zero. The case reminds us that evil does leave traces, no matter how carefully hidden, that the smallest pieces of evidence can speak the loudest truths, that victims aren't defined by what happens to them, but by what they choose to do afterward. And it reminds us that sometimes, in the darkest moments, we find strength we never knew we possessed. Bobby Joe Long spent his final years on death row, knowing that a 17-year-old girl had outsmarted him, knowing that microscopic fibers he never even knew existed had sealed his fate. knowing that his crimes, which he thought he'd gotten away with, had left an indelible trail of evidence. The red carpet in his Dodge Magnum, meant to provide comfort, instead provided justice. Lisa McVey Noland still drives through Tampa sometimes, past the location where she was abducted over 40 years ago. But she's not that scared 17-year-old girl anymore. She's a master deputy, a mother, a grandmother, a survivor who became a warrior, a voice for the voiceless. And somewhere in an evidence room, carefully preserved in sealed containers, those microscopic red fibers remain. Silent witnesses to terrible crimes. Tiny threads that spoke volumes about guilt. The smallest pieces of evidence that solved one of Tampa's most terrifying cases. Sometimes the truth isn't written in blood or bullets. Sometimes it's written in threads too small to see, but too strong to break. Red threads of justice that connected a killer to his victims and a survivor to her strength. That's the final truth of the Tampa Serial Killer case. Evil thought it could hide in the darkness, in the shadows of Nebraska Avenue, in the forgotten corners where society's most vulnerable lived and worked. But it couldn't hide from science. It couldn't hide from a 17-year-old girl's courage. And it couldn't hide from those microscopic red fibers that clung to the truth even when everything else seemed lost. The case was solved by the smallest clues and the strongest spirit. By forensics and fortitude. By science and survival. And in the end, justice prevailed. Not because it was easy, not because it was quick, but because people like Detective Gary Terry and Lisa McVey Noland refused to give up. The red threads caught a killer, and a survivor changed the world.